Chapter 2. The Cradle of the Race in Ancient Japanese Thought. According to the most ancient texts, Japan is the center of the earth. W. E. Griffiths. According to the earliest cosmogony of the Japanese, as given in their most ancient book, the Kojiki, the creators and first inhabitants of our world were a god and goddess, Izanagi and Izanani by name. These, in the beginning, we quote from Sir Edward Reed, standing on the bridge of heaven, pushed down a spear into the green plain of the sea, and stirred it round and round. When they drew it up, the drops which fell from its end consolidated and became an island. The sun-born pair descended on the island, and planting a spear in the ground, point downwards, built a palace round it, taking that for their central roof pillar. The spear became the axis of the earth, which had been caused to revolve the stirring round. This island, however, was the Japanese Eden. Here originated the human race. Its name was Anorgorojima, the island of the congealed drop. Its first roof pillar, as we have seen, was the axis of the earth. Over it was the pivot of the vault of heaven. Mr. Reed, who has no theory on the subject to maintain, says, "The island must have been situated at the pole of the earth." In like manner, with no idea of the vast anthropological significance and value of the datum, Mr. Griffiths remarks, "The island formed by the congealed drops was once at the North Pole, but has since been taken to its present position in the inland sea." Here, then, is the testimony of the most ancient Japanese tradition. Nothing could be more unequivocal. Iganazi's divinely precious spear of jade, like the transverse jade tube of the ancient Shu king, is an imperishable index, not only to the astronomical attainments of prehistoric humanity, but also to humanity's prehistoric abode. In Part 5th, Chapter 4th, further illustration of the Japanese conception of the origin of their race will be given. Chapter 3. The Cradle of the Race in Chinese Thought. The rationalistic genius of the matter-of-fact Chinese is apparent even in the way in which they conceive their primitive history, and in this respect, as in many others, it brings them into nearer relations with the best modern science that belonged to the other Oriental races. Samuel Johnson, of Salem. It is through this wonderfully pure seer, as it appears to me, that we ascend to the primitive revelation of truth given to this ancient people. William Henry Channing. Approaching this theme, a reviewer of the Shinsin Tangkin, a general account of the gods and genii, in 22 volumes, offers the following observations. All nations have some tradition of a paradise, a place of primeval happiness, a state of innocence and delight. The Taoists are by no means behind in referring to an abode of lasting bliss, which, however, still exists on earth. It is called Quanlan. In another article, by a student of Chinese sources, it is stated, "This locality, being the abode of the gods, is paradise. It is round in form, and like Eden, it is the Mount of Assembly." Like the Gan Eden of Genesis, it is described as a garden, with a marvelous tree in the midst, also with a fountain of immortality, from which proceed 4 rivers, which flow in opposite directions toward the 4 quarters of the earth. In the language of the writer first quoted in this chapter, sparkling fountains and purling streams contain the far-famed ambrosia. One may there rest on flowery carpeted swords, listening to the melodious warbling of birds, or feasting upon the delicious fruits, at once fragrant and luscious, which hang from the branches of the luxuriant groves. Whatever there is beautiful in landscape or grand in nature may also be found there in the highest state of perfection. All is charming, all enchanting, and whilst nature smiles, the company of genii delights and ravished visitor. Where, now, is this paradise mountain located? At the North Pole? The sentence before those last quoted reads as follows. Here is the great pillar that sustains the world, no less than 300,000 miles high. This world pillar, or axis of the earth, is sometimes conceived of as slender enough for the use of a climber. Thus we read, one of the Chinese kings, anxious to become acquainted with the delightful spot, set out in search of it. After much wandering, he perceived the immense column spoken of, but, trying to ascend it, he found it so slippery that he had to abandon all hopes of gaining its end, and to endeavor by some mountain road which was rugged in the extreme to find his way to paradise. When almost fainting with fatigue, some friendly nymphs, who had all the time from an eminence compassionated the weary wanderer, lent him an assisting hand. He arrived there, and immediately began to examine the famous spot. Such a pillar connecting the earth with an upper paradise, and affording a means of access thereto, necessarily recalls to mind the analogous conception set forth in the Talmud. There is an upper and a lower paradise, and between them, upright, is fixed a pillar, and by this they are joined together, and 'tis called the strength of the hill of Sion. And by this pillar on every Sabbath and festival the righteous climb up and feed themselves with a glance of the divine majesty till the end of the Sabbath or festival, when they slide down and return into the lower paradise. In this conception we have a twofold paradise, one celestial and one terrestrial. Among the Chinese we find the same. The upper is situated in the center or pole of heaven, the lower directly under it, at the center or pole of the northern terrestrial hemisphere. The pillar connecting them is, of course, the axis of the heavenly vault. We quote, "Within the seas, in the valleys of Quenlun, at the northwest is Shangtai's lower recreation palace. It is 800 li square and 80,000 feet high. In front there are 9 walls, enclosed by a fence of precious stones. At the sides there are 9 doors, through which the light streams, and it is guarded by beasts. Shangtai's wife also dwells in this region, immediately over which is Shangtai's heavenly palace, which is situated in the center of the heavens, the celestial pole, and his earthly one is in the center of the earth, the terrestrial pole. There can be no mistaking of this use of the term center for pole, for the Chinese astronomers expressly state, the polar star is the center of heaven. Elsewhere, instead of Quenlun being a world pillar in the valleys, or plain, or mound of the terrestrial paradise, we find it described as a stupendous heaven-sustaining mountain, marking the center or pole of the earth. The 4 quarters of the earth incline downwards. On this vast plain, or mount, surrounded on all sides by the 4 seas, arise the mountains of Quenlun, the highest in the world according to the Chinese geographers. Quenlun is the name of a mountain. It is situated at the northwest, 50,000 li from the Swankao Mountains, and it is the center of the earth. It is 11,000 li in height. The significance of the foregoing as respects the location of paradise cannot be doubtful, but compare further the 6th head under chapter 3rd of part 5th, also chapter 4th of the same part. Chapter 4. The Cradle of the Race in East Aryan or Hindu Thought. The reader cannot have failed to be struck, as the first explorers of Sanskrit literature have been, with the close analogy, we might even say the perfect identity, of all the essential features of the typical description of Mount Meru in the Puranas with the topography of Eden in the 2nd chapter of Genesis. The Garden of Eden, the Garden of God, which is guarded by the anointed and protecting cherub, is placed, like the Garden of Delight of the gods of India, on the summit of a mountain, the holy mountain of God, all sparkling with precious stones. Lenormand. In what kind of world lived the ancient Brahmin, and what was his conception of the location of the cradle of the race? One of the oldest of the elaborate geographical treatises of India is the Vishnu Purana. Taking this as a guide, let us place ourselves alongside one of the ancients of the country, and look about us. First, we will look to the south, far down the Indian Ocean. What was supposed to lie in that direction? To begin with their distribution of the different quarters of world among the gods, This is the quarter belonging to Yama, the god of the dead. May he whose hands the thunder wield be in the east thy guard and shield. May Yama's care the south befriend, and Varun's arm the west defend. And let Kuvera, lord of gold, the north and firm protection hold. In precise accordance with our key to ancient cosmology, it is the direction of descent. North is upwards, south is downwards. Hence the abode and kingdom of Yama is not only to the south, but also below the level of India, i.e. on the under hemisphere, or, as Monier Williams locates it, in the lower world. All Hindu literature is full of similar references. The exact time required for the soul's journey was supposed to be 4 hours and 40 minutes. In this direction, evidently, we shall vainly seek a paradise. Let us turn to the north and ascend. First, of course, we come to the Himalaya range, the Himavat of Indian geography. All that portion of the earth lying between this mountain range and the great ocean to the south constitutes one of the 7 or 9 Varshas, or divisions of the habitable hemisphere. Its name is Bharata. If now our ancient Hindu could proceed due north and cross the Himavat, which he does not think possible to mortals, he would find himself in Kimpurusha, an equally extensive but more elevated and beautiful Varsha, extending northward till bounded by a second range of incredibly lofty mountains, the Himakuta. Still, ascending, or going north, until he had crossed this division and passed the Himakuta, he would enter Harivarsha, a still loftier and diviner country. This extends, in turn, to another boundary range, the Nishadha, crossing which would come to the Ilavrita, the central Varsha of all, which occupies the top as well as the center of the world. To the adequate description of the beauty and glory and preciousness of this country no tongue is equal. In its center is situated the Mount of the Gods, beautiful Meru, described in chapter 1 of the present part. It is at the pole, and around it revolve all constellations of heaven. It is the center of the habitable world. Continuing our imaginary journey across this divine country of Ilavrita, crossing, of course, this colossal central mountain, we should now begin to descend on the meridian opposite to that on which we ascended on the India side of the globe. The boundary of the central region on that side is the Nila range. Then comes the Varsha of Rumyaka, its farther boundary in the Sweta range. Beyond it is the Varsha of Hiranmaya. Still descending, we cross this and the range which bounds it on the farther side, the Sringin, and we are in Uttarakuru, the last of the 7 grand divisions of the earth, the one corresponding, in distance from Meru, to Bharata, or our starting point. It, of course, is on the equatorial ocean, and here too we have only to cross this ocean in order to reach the underworld. The way in which the Varashas are made to number 9 is by subdividing the great central cross-section of the hemispherical surface, leaving Ilavrita a perfect square on top of the globe, the land descending eastward to the sea being called Bhadravasa, and the corresponding country to the west being called Ketumala. To assist the reader to a clearer conception of the sacred geography, we give herewith 2 cuts, one of which presents in outline the side aspect of the Puranic earth, and the other a flat polocentric projection of its upper hemisphere. Having now answered our first question, and showed in what kind of a world the ancient Hindu lived, we pass to the second. What was his conception of the location of the cradle of the race? The question is answered the moment we say that in the Hindu conception and tradition, man proceeded from Meru. His Eden land was Ilavrita. It was therefore at the pole. How strange that Lenormand could have written the following and still have imagined that the true primeval Eden of the Hindu was anywhere else than at the terrestrial pole. He says, in all the legends of India, the origin of mankind is placed on Mount Meru, the residence of the god, a column which unites the sky to the earth. At first sight, on reading the description of Mount Meru furnished by the Puranas, it appears overcharged with so many purely mythological features that one hesitates to believe that it has any basis in reality. To realize these descriptions, one must represent oneself in the center of a vast level and very elevated surface, surrounded by various mountain ranges, a gigantic block, the axis of the world, raising its head to the highest point of the heavens, whence there falls upon its summit, on the North Pole, the divine Gaia, the source of all rivers, which there discharges itself into an ideal lake, the Manasa Sarovara. Meru, then, is at one and the same time the highest part of the terrestrial world and the central point of the visible heaven, the two having been confounded through ignorance of the real constitution of the universe. It is also, at one and the same time, the North Pole and the center of the habitable earth, Jambudvita, literally the continent of the tree Jambu, the tree of life. Leaving the higher basin of the mountain in which its writers have at first collected the source, Gaia travels 7 miles round the Meru in descending from the abode of the 7 rishis of the Great Bear, to empty itself afterward into 4 lakes, placed on 4 summits adjacent to this vast pyramid, and serving as buttresses on its 4 sides. Fed by the waters of the celestial Gaia, and the 4 lakes in their turn feed 4 terrestrial rivers which flow out through the mouths of 4 symbolical animals. These 4 great rivers water as many distinct regions, and discharge themselves into 4 opposite seas, to the east, south, west, and north of the central Meru. The 4 lakes, the 4 rivers, and the 4 oceans are composed of different liquids, corresponding to the 4 castes, and these latter, with which are connected all nations of the human race, are reputed to have set out from the 4 sides of Meru to people the whole earth. A similar illustration of the power of a wrong prepossession is given us by the illustrious Karl Ritter, who, after expressly declaring that the numberless Puranas and their most diverse interpretations by the pundits teach that Meru is the middle of the earth, and itself literally designates the center and axis, thereupon the coolest manner imaginable proceeds to identify the same sacred height with the mountains of Central Asia. Still worse is the procedure of Mr. Massey, who, after locating the Garden of Eden on Mount Meru, and saying explicitly, the pole, or polar region, is Meru, and again, Meru is the garden of the tree of life, nevertheless tells us that in equatorial Africa beasts first grew into men. Happier is the inconsistency of Mr. Lilly, who, despite his adhesion to the flat earth theory of Hindu cosmology, still incidentally speaks of the blissful garden as at the pole. Chapter 5. The Cradle of the Race in Iranian, or Old Persian, Thought. Aus an Angbin über die Paradiesstrome und der Lauf des Lebens erhält nun auch, wo wir das Paradies selbst zu suchen haben, nämlich im österlichen Norden. Frau Spiegel. According to the sacred books of the ancient Persians, and all 25 races of men, which people the 7 Kevares of the earth descended from one primitive pair, whose names were Mashioi and Mashia. The abode of this primitive pair was the Kashvari Kavrianas, the central and the fairest of the 7. Let us see if we can determine its location. As a key to the old Iranian conception of the world, let us investigate the nature and location of the Chinvat Bridge. This, like the Bifrost of the Northmen and the Al-Sirat of Islam, is the bridge on which the souls of the dead, the evil as well as the good, leave this world to enter the unseen. The investigation is in itself and for its own sake full of interest, for no writer on the ideas of the faith of the Mazdanas has ever professed to be able to tell either the origin or true meaning of the myth. Most interpreters have either carefully abstained from all attempts at explanation, or have suggested that it probably refers to the rainbow or to the Milky Way, or to both. To dispose of these suggestions, let us raise a few questions. 1. Do we find in any part of the Avestan literature any evidence that the Chinvat Bridge possessed a curvilinear form? None. 2. Straight or curved as a whole, were its two ends conceived of as a common level? No, for motion upon it in one direction is described as upward, and in the opposite direction as downward. 3. Where was the upper end? In the heaven of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god, to whose abode the bridge conducts good souls. 4. But where is this abode? At the northern pole of the sky, as elsewhere shown. 5. Where is the earthward end? It rests upon the Datic peak. 6. Is this peak in Persia? No, it is part of a sacred mountain in Aran Vaj, the Eden of Iranian tradition. 7. And where is Aran Vaj? In the middle of the world. 8. In what Keshver? In Gvaniras, the central of the 7 divisions of the earth, and the one in which men and the good religion were first created. 9. And in what direction from Persia was Aran Vaj supposed to lie? Far to the north. 10. What natural center of the earth is situated in that direction? The North Pole. 11. What other evidence is there that Datic Peak is at the North Pole? The fact that the mountain of which this is simply the peak of judgment, the Heraberazeti, around which the heavenly bodies revolve, and which, as all allow, answers to the North Pole or Sumeru of the Hindus. 12. Then the Chinvat Bridge extends from the North Pole of the heavens to the North Pole of the earth? What is its shape? It is beam-shaped. To quote the sacred book, that bridge is like a beam of many sides, of whose edges there are some which are broad, and there are some which are thin and sharp. Its broad sides are so large that its width is 27 reeds, and its sharp sides are so concentrated that in thinness it is just like the edge of a razor. And when the souls of the righteous and wicked arrive, it turns to them that side which is suitable to their necessities. The Chinvat Bridge, then, is simply the axis of the northern heavens, the Pillar of Atlas, the Talmudic strength of the Hill of Sion, the column which in the Chinese legend the emperor vainly sought to climb. In solving this long-standing problem, we have at the same time unlocked the mystery which has hitherto attached to Bifrost and El Sirat. But in locating our bridge, we have located the Persian Eden, and the location is unquestionably at the North Pole. More than this, we have made clear the fact that in the mythical or sacred geography of this ancient people, the world of living men was originally the northern circumpolar hemisphere. The arrangement of the Keshvars now becomes entirely clear. Like the divinely beautiful Ilavrita Varsha of the Hindus, illustrious Gvaniras holds the central position. In its center, as the center of Ilavrita, is the holiest mound in the world. Directly over it is the true heaven. In this central polar country, north and south and east and west would have no application. But speaking from their own geographical standpoint as south of Iran Vaj, the Persians located to the east in this holy central Kavaniras, to the Keshver Sava, to the west Arza, to the south the Keshvers Fradafsh and Vidafsh, and to the north Vorubarst and Vorugarst. This gives a map of the northern hemisphere, which in a plane polocentric projection may be represented as on the foregoing page, the polar center, of course, being occupied by Heraberazeti. It would be a fascinating task to reinterpret the whole Avestan literature and mythology in the new light of this recovered geography and cosmology, but this would require a book of itself. It is worthy of remark that Venedat expressly calls the earth round, and apparently recognizes the existence of two far-separated poles. As we have seen, its Chinvat Bridge, or beam, which is also an idea so ancient as to be found in the Avesta itself, is the axis of the world, conducting good souls by an upward flight into the North Polar heaven of Ahura Mazda, but the evil by a fall head foremost into the South Polar hell. Iran Vaj, or Old Iran, was the most natural name in the world for the Iranians to give to the traditional birthplace of their race, but all attempts to find it on the banks of the Aras or in the far-off lands of the rising sun are evidently useless. Equally mistaken is the gloss which merely makes it primitively the mythic land where the disembodied souls of the righteous are assembled by Ahura Mazda. The same must be said of the assertion that the real site of the Iran Vaj, in its ancient and original conception, is to the east of the Caspian Sea and of Lake Aral. By every particular of its description it is identified with the Datic Peak, which Hera-Berzeti, with the polar river, the polar tree, the polar center of the upper hemisphere. It is simply the Arctic Eden of humanity remembered as it was before the Evil One entered, and by his witchcraft counter-created winter and the worst of plagues. This being the case, we need not wonder that in a paper on the Aryan birthplace, read in January 1884, before the Royal Society of Literature, Mr. C.J. Stone expressed his strong doubt of the current doctrine that the cradle of the Aryans was the upper valley of the Oxus. The cradle of the whole Aryan family will at last be found to be in Iran the Ancient, and this in the Arctic birthplace of man. Chapter 6. The cradle of the race in ancient Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian thought. We have here, even to the most minute details, an exact reproduction of the Aryan conception of Mount Meru, or Alborz, with its accessories. Here is the abode of the heavenly hierarchy, located on the summit of the Karsak, or sacred mount which penetrates the heavens exactly in the regions of the pole star. Reverend O.D. Miller. We have already seen that the prehistoric inhabitants of the Tigro-Euphrates basin, called by some Akkadians, by others Sumerians, by yet others Akkado-Sumerians, had, like other Asiatic peoples, their mountain of the world, on whose top was the celestial paradise, and around which sun, moon, and stars revolved. Our present task is to locate this mountain more exactly, and to consider its significance for our hypothesis respecting the site of Eden. That the earth, as conceived of by this ancient people, was spherical is not at the present day question. With their ideas, probably no archaeologist was more familiar than the late Francois Lenormand, and he expresses himself as follows. The Chaldees, says Diodorus Siculus, have quite an opinion of their own about the shape of the earth. They imagine it to have the form of a boat turned upside down, and to be hollow underneath. This opinion remained to the last in the Chaldean sacerdotal schools. Their astronomers believed in it, and tried, according to Diodorus, to support it by scientific arguments. It is of very ancient origin, a remnant of the ideas of purely Akkadian period. Let us imagine, then, a boat, turned over, not such an one as we are in the habit of seeing, but a round skiff, like those which are still used under the name of Kufa in the shores of the lower Tigris and Euphrates, and of which there are many representations in the historical sculptures of the Assyrian palaces. The sides of this round skiff bend upwards from the point of the greatest width, so that they are shaped like a hollow sphere deprived of 2/3 of its height, and showing a circular opening at the point of division. Such was the form of the earth according to the authors of the Akkadian magical formulae and the Chaldean astrologers of after years. We should express the same idea in the present day by comparing it to an orange of which the top had been cut off, leaving the orange upright upon the flat surface thus produced. The upper and convex surface constituted the earth properly so called. The inhabitable earth, or terraqueous surface, to the collective name Kalama, or the countries, is also given. It is well known that in minor details Diodorus is often found not altogether trustworthy. He was not a critical reporter. While, therefore, in the above quotation he has undoubtedly preserved to us one of the ancient Chaldean similes, by use of which the true figure of the earth was taught, I can but think of the statement as to the hollowness of the earth underneath is an unauthorized inference, suggested by the hollow boat, and made by comparatively uninstructed Greek solely upon his own responsibility. It is true that, in the same work from which the above extract is taken, Lenormand endeavors to adjust Akkadian cosmology to such a notion of a hollow sphere, saying, "The interior concavity opening from underneath was the terrestrial abyss, Gaia, where the dead found a home. The central point in it was the nadir, or, as it was called, the root, Uru, the foundation of the whole structure of the world. This gloomy region witnessed the nocturnal journey from the sun. But nothing can be more evident on examination than that this attempt involves the writer in at least 3 inconsistencies. First, if the sun visits the interior of the earth at night, its proper orbit cannot be round the mountain of the world to the northeast of Babylonia, as our author elsewhere represents. Second, if Arali, the abode of the dead, is in the interior of the hollow earth, it cannot be to the northeast of Babylonia, as it is represented to be in the context. Third, if the earth was conceived of as hollow, of course its whole central portion was empty space, but according to this presentation its central point was called the root, Uru, the foundation of the whole structure of the world. Surely the foundation of the world can scarcely have been supposed to be more emptiness. To a layman in these studies, this Uru would much rather suggest the Antarctic Tapanto mountain of ancient Egyptian thought, the Kurumuru of ancient India. But it is time to return to the Akkadian, or Akkado-Sumerian, mountain of the gods. Again we quote Lenormand. Above the earth extended the sky, spangled with its fixed stars, and revolving round the mountain of the east, the column which joins the heavens and the earth, and serves as an axis to the celestial vault.
For Dungeons and Dragons fans, Cryptic Studios,
the culminating point of the heavens,
set out to make Neverwinter the most action.
The culminating point in the heavens, the zenith, was not this axis or pole. On the contrary, it was situated immediately above the country of Acadia, which was regarded as the center of the inhabited lands, whilst the mountain which acted as a pivot to the starry heavens was to the northeast of this country. Beyond the mountain, and also to the northeast, extended the land of Arali, which was very rich in gold, and was inhabited by the gods and blessed spirits. Here we have the mountain of the east, located not in the east, but in the northeast. Elsewhere, our author recognizes most fully the identity of this mount with the Har Moed of Isaiah, chapter 14, verse 14, and the difficulty of placing it anywhere but at the North Pole. He adduces from the cuneiform texts no evidence whatever for a location to the northeast, and seems to fix upon that direction only as a compromise of his own. Nous devons conclure is his language. His only reason for thinking of any other position than one due north appears to be a cuneiform expression which seems to make Karsakura the same time the mountain of the sunrise. This, in reality, instead of being a reason for searching among the mountains to the east of Assyria or Babylonia, is, when rightly understood, precisely an additional reason for looking to the north. One other statement in the extract calls for notice. The writer seems to have anticipated that his readers would inevitably locate a mountain described as the column which joins the heavens and the earth and serves as an access to the celestial vault under the celestial pole, and believing that the cuneiform texts which locate the celestial pole directly over Akkad, or Acadia, the center of the inhabited lands, to be inconsistent with such a location, he introduces the remark that the culminating point in the heavens was not the axis or pole. On the contrary, it was situated immediately over the country of Acadia, which was regarded as the center of the inhabited lands, whilst the mountain which acted as a pivot to the starry heavens was to the northeast of this country. From so eminent an authority, one naturally hesitates to differ. But inasmuch as Monsieur Joachim Menard, in a work as recent as the one from which we have quoted, while agreeing with Monsieur Lemanat in making Akkad the traditional center of the earth, differs from him in locating precisely in the central country the mountain on whose apex the heaven of the fixed stars is pivoted, we cannot avoid the conclusion that Lenormand's distinction between the zenith of Akkad and the celestial pole is based upon a misapprehension, and is productive only of confusion. The solution of all difficulties is found the moment the mythological Akkad is made a circumpolar mother country, after which the Akkad of the Tigro-Euphrates Valley was commemoratively named. This supposition is made all the easier by three noteworthy facts. 1. That both the names Akkad and Sumer are not Assyrio-Babylonian, but loanwords from an older prehistoric tongue. 2. That the etymological signification and appellatives of Akkad thoroughly identify it with the lofty country at the North Polar summit of the Earth. And 3. That recently discovered tablets are compelling the Assyriologists to recognize two Akkads, one in the Tigro-Euphrates Valley and one much farther to the north, though as yet none of these scholars have looked as far in that direction as to the pole. If further proof were needed that the Karsa Kura of the earliest inhabitants of Mesopotamia was identified with the North Polar World Mountain of Egypt and the surrounding Asiatic nations, it would be found on investigating their conception of the region of the disembodied dead and their notion of a mountain of the rulers of the dead antipodal to the Mount of the Gods. The Akkadians, like the ancients generally, conceived of the realm of the dead as located to the south, their underworld being simply the under or southern hemisphere of the earth. They could not place it in any other direction. In naming the cardinal points, the Akkadians therefore called the south the funeral point. In this quarter was located the Mount of the Rulers of the Dead. It was the under or south polar projection of the earth. It corresponded with the south polar Mount of Demons in Hindu and in Egyptian thought. Even Lenormand, whose mistake in locating the Mount of the Gods in the east logically leads to the mistake of locating this Mount of the Rulers of the Dead in the west, still unconsciously gives evidence as to the true location by stating that it is situated in the low-down portions of the earth. And elsewhere he has told us that in the Akkadian language, to descend and to go southward were synonymous with expressions. With Professor Friedrich Dietzle, Delitzsch, then, we locate the Akkadian Karsa Kura at the north. Once make the primeval Akkad the equivalent of Ilavrita in Hindu, or of Kvaniras in Iranian mythology, and all is perfectly plain and self-consistent. The primitive Akkad is now the center of all lands in the same sense in which Ilavrita and Kvaniras are in their respective systems. As in both these systems, the Mount of the Gods is in the center of the central country. So is Karsa Kura. Sumeru and Heraberezaiti and Kwanlun are each exactly under the pole star, having it in their zenith. The same is true of Karsa Kura. As every splendor of a divine abode crowns the top of all the former, so is the summit of Karsak resplendent beyond description. As the sun, moon, and stars revolve around the Hindu and Iranian and Chinese mounts, so is Karsak the point on which the heaven of the fixed stars is pivoted. Moreover, from its top flows the Eden River, which, like Ganga and Ardvisura, waters the whole earth. Under these circumstances, the candid reader will probably be prepared to agree with the statement of Mr. Miller, which we have made the motto to this chapter, and to say, with Gerald Massey, only with better understanding than his, the cradle of the Akkadian race was the mountain of the world, that mount of the congregation in the thighs of the north. The first mount of mythology was the mount of the 7 stars, 7 steps, 7 stages, 7 caves, which represented the celestial north as the birthplace of the initial motion and the beginning of time. This starting point in heaven above is the one original for the many copies found on the earth below. The Akkadians date from Urdu, the district of the northern mountain of the world. Chapter 7. The Cradle of the Race in Ancient Egyptian Thought. According to the Kamite legend related by Diodorus, Osiris and Isis lived together in Nysa, or Paradise. Here there was a garden wherein the deathless dwelt. Here they lived in perfect happiness until Osiris was seized with the desire to drink the water of immortality. Then he went forth in search of it, and fell. But an earlier couple than Osiris and Isis was Sefk and Taurt, who, as the two constellations of the 7 stars revolving round the tree, or pole, were the primeval pair in paradise. The natural genesis. The mythical geography of the ancient Egyptians is as yet too little known to allow us to hope for much light from this quarter of the question of the site of Eden. Even their cosmology is little understood, and their scientific attainments are by many inexcusably underestimated. So good a scholar as Mr. Villiers Stewart could recently write, the Egyptians had not attained to a sufficiently advanced point in science to solve the problem of how the sun, in his daily course, having sunk behind the western horizon, returned to rise at the opposite quarter of the heavens. Nevertheless, as we desire to test our hypothesis as far as possible by all most ancient traditions and myths, whether favorable or unfavorable, we must inquire whether anything can be ascertained as to the ideas of the ancient Egyptians touching the form of the earth and the theater of man's first history. The leading features of Egyptian cosmology, as interpreted by the present writer, are in perfect accord with the cosmological ideas of other ancient nations, as described in Chapter 1 of the present division. They may be briefly expressed in the 6 following theses. 1. That in ancient Egyptian thought, the earth was conceived of as a sphere, with its axis perpendicular and its north pole at the top. 2. That in the earliest time, Amenti was conceived of neither as a cavern in the bowels of the earth, nor as a region of the earth to the west, on the same general plane as the land of Egypt, but was simply the under or southern hemisphere of the earth, conceived of as just described. 3. That the Tat pillar symbolized the axis of the world, heaven and earth, upright in space. 4. That Ta Unter, whatever its latter applications, originally signified the extreme northern or topmost point of the globe, where earth and heaven were fabled to meet. 5. That Shernuter was the inferior celestial hemisphere underarching Amenti. 6. That Hes and Nebta, Isis and Nephthys, were respectively goddesses of the north and south poles, or of the northern and southern heavens. Assuming now, with Chabas, Liblan, Lefebvre, and Ebers, that the earth of the ancient Egyptians, like that of the ancient Asiatic nations, was spherical, what was their conception of its northern terminus? In Chapter 1 of this part, some indication has been already given, but our present investigation demands a fuller answer to this question. Turning to the great work of Brugsch on the geographical inscriptions of the old Egyptian monuments, we find that the Egyptians considered the farthest limit in the north to be the 4 pillars or supports of heaven. The fact that these 4 supports of heaven, instead of being situated in 4 opposite directions from Egypt, are all in the farthest north, is very significant. It shows that though the people might speak of heaven as supported on 4 pillars, it is not to be inferred therefrom that they conceived of the earth as flat, and the sky as a flat oriental roof 1 story above it. Brugsch himself, though, writing upon the supposition that the Egyptians' earth was flat, avoids this mistake. His inference, coming from one who had a traditional wrong theory to support, is most interesting and valuable. He says, inasmuch as these 4 supports of heaven, the northern limit of the earth is as known to the Egyptians, nowhere else occur as name of people, land, or river, it seems to be most probable that we have herein the designation of a high mountain which was perhaps characterized by 4 peaks, or which consisted of 4 ranges, from which peculiarity it received its name. Like all peoples of antiquity, at least all those whose literature has come down to us, the Egyptians conceived of the earth as rising toward the north, so that at last at its northernmost point it joined the sky and supported it. In the Buddhist conception of Meru, as given in Chapter 1 of this part, we have precisely the 4-peaked, heaven-supporting mountain which Brugsch here describes. Each of the 4 corners of the mountaintop has a peak 700 yojanas high. It is not impossible that in the four dwarfs which support the dome of the modern Buddhist temple, we have a far-off survival of ancient Egypt's four supports of heaven. Certainly, the Buddhist temple roof symbolized the circumpolar heaven, and a recent author, touching upon the latter's mythological support, writes as follows: "This prop, passing through the earth and the heavens at the pole, indicated as we have seen by the Alpha of Draco, became the nail of the old astronomers, the point round which all nature revolved. Between Earth and the celestial pole, the prop idea was again brought forward as the central column of a huge conical mountain, Mount Meru, guarded at each cardinal point by a mighty king. The four dwarfs propping up some of the columns in the old Buddhist temples are evidently these four kings. When the prop pierced the highest heaven, it was a spire called the Ti, and in Nepal it is confessedly in all the temples the symbol of Adi Buddha, the Supreme, in his heavenly garden, Nandana Grove." But returning from this merely curious question, we remind ourselves that we have seen reason to believe that the ancient Egyptians conceived of the earth as a sphere, with a heaven-supporting mountain in the extreme north. In the extreme south was another mountain, the Horn of the World, represented as of incredible height, 8 atur or stadia. This corresponds so perfectly with the earth of the Puranas, with its Sumeru and Kumeru, that we are irresistibly impelled to inquire whether the parallelism extends any farther. We take the question of the direction of the abode of the dead. All agree that in Indian thought the abode of the dead is in the south. So was it in the thought of the ancient Egyptian. The recently discovered epitaph of Queen Isis-Amkeb, mother-in-law of Shishak, king of Assyria, thus reads, "She is seated all beautiful in her place enthroned. Among the gods of the south she is crowned with flowers. She is seated in her beauty in the arms of Khonsau, her father fulfilling his desires. He is in Amenti, the place of departed spirits." Again, in the mythological earth of India, the abode of the dead, being the southern or under hemisphere, is looked upon as inverted. Viewed from the standpoint of gods and men, it is bottom upward, and its inhabitants move about head downward. The same is true of Amenti, the Egyptian underworld, and of its inhabitants. Again, in Hindu thought, all deadly influences proceed from the south. The abode of death, all beneficent and life-giving influences from the north. The same is true in ancient Egyptian thought. "It is curious," says the English editor of Lenormant's Chaldean Magic, "it is curious that in Egypt all good and healing and life proceeded from the west, the land of the setting sun, and all evil from the east, the land of its rising." The statement is curiously incorrect. The north is the sacred quarter, and from the north come life and blessing. The north wind is the very breath of God. It proceeds from the nostrils of Khnum, and enlivens all creatures. It is one of the high prerogatives of the blessed dead to breathe the delicious air of the north wind. That they may breathe, it is the prayer of bereaved affliction. The fields of peace are at the north of the fields of Sanemu. There is the proper home of the great God of whom the Nile poets sang. There is no building that can contain him. There is no counselor in thy heart. Thy youth delight in thee, thy children. Thou directest them as king. Thy law is established in the whole land, in the presence of thy servants in the north. Of the same God it is said, He createth all works therein, all writings, all sacred words, all his implements in the north. As yet no texts have been discovered which represent the earliest Egyptian ideas of the origin of man and the location of his birthplace. One proof, however, that man was conceived of as having proceeded from the land of the gods in the north appears in connection with the myth of the reign of Ra. In Egyptian mythology, the reign of Ra was like the primeval reign of Kronos. The myth of it was a reminiscence of the sinless golden age. But in those primeval and perfect days, men still dwelt in the country of the gods, which country, as we have seen, was in the highest north. And because they still occupied the heaven-touching mountain, the rebellion by which they forfeited their estate of blessedness is expressly described as on the mountain, an object not easily found in Egypt. The same teaching is further supported by the language of certain scholars, who, without any particular theory as to the location of Eden, have held that the hieroglyph used in Egyptian texts as the determinative prefix to names designating civilized lands is simply a pictorial symbol of primitive Eden divided by its fourfold river. A writer in the Edinburgh Review, said to be Mr. Walter Wilkins, remarks, "The Buddhists and Brahmins, who together constitute nearly half the population of the world, tell us that the deusated figure of the cross, whether in a simple or complex form, symbolizes the traditional happy abode of their primeval ancestors, the paradise of Eden towards the east, as we find it expressed in the Hebrew. And, let us ask, what better picture or more significant characters in the complicated alphabet of symbolism could have been selected for the purpose than a circle and a cross? The one to denote a region of absolute purity and perpetual felicity, the other those four perennial streams that divided and watered the several quarters of it." Mr. Wilkins claims that in the Egyptian hieroglyph above given, we have the same symbol as the Indian swastika. It was therefore primeval paradise which was commemorated by the sacred circular cakes of the Egyptians, composed of the richest materials, of flour, of honey, of milk, and with which the serpent and bull, as well as the other reptiles and beasts consecrated to the service of Isis and their higher divinities, were daily fed, and which upon certain festivals were eaten with extraordinary ceremony by the people and their priests. He continues, "The cross cake," says Sir Gardner Wilkinson, "was their hieroglyph for civilized land, obviously a land superior to their own, as it was, indeed, to all mundane territories, for it was that distant, traditional country of sempiternal contentment and repose, of exquisite delight and serenity, where nature, unassisted by man, produces all that is necessary for his sustentation. This," says Donnelly, though arguing in favor of a mid-Atlantic island Eden, "was the Garden of Eden of our race. In the midst of it was a sacred and glorious eminence, the umbilicus orbis terrarum, toward which the heathen in all parts of the world, and in all ages, turned a wistful gaze in every act of devotion, and to which they hoped to be admitted, or rather to be restored, at the close of this transitory scene." In Part 5th, Chapter 4th, it will be shown that the umbilicus orbis terrarum is indisputably the terrestrial pole. Finally, if, as Plato represents, the story of lost Atlantis was received from Egypt, and constituted a part of the priestly teaching of the dwellers upon the Nile, our next chapter will present us further evidence that the Eden and the antediluvian world of ancient Egyptian tradition were precisely where the tradition of other ancient peoples placed them, to wit, in the land of sacred memories in the far-off, fairy north. Chapter 8. The Cradle of the Race in Ancient Greek Thought. In the center of the sea is the white isle of great Zeus. There is Mount Ida, and our race's cradle, Aeneas. All that is beautiful and rare seems to come from the north, Herodotus. When transactions are of such antiquity, it is not wonderful if the history should prove obscure, Plutarch. The writings that narrate these fables, not being delivered as inventions of the writers, but as things before believed and received, appear like a soft whisper from the traditions of more ancient nations, conveyed through the flutes of the Grecians. Bacon. Respecting the origin of men, there were among Greek writers, as Preller states, very different opinions. Part of this diversity he ascribes to a difference in the natural environment of the first inhabitants. Some, residing in the woody hills, would naturally think the first men came from these. Others, inhabiting a valley, would more naturally think of their ancestors as having come out of the water. The Asiatic Greek belief that the first of the human race were made out of trees he calls quite peculiar. What if it should be found that all these notions were merely fragments of an old faith, according to which man originated on the mountain of all mountains, by the source of all waters, and under the tree of all trees? However this may be, it is certainly very interesting to note that in the Greek myth of Meropia, or Meropis, Renan, Lenormand, and others, recognize the old Asiatic Meru. They hold that the sacred expression Europes Avorotho originally meant the men sprung from Meru. Stephanus has the same rendering in his Thesaurus. In an advanced chapter of his Origine de l'Histoire, Lenormand expresses himself on this point as follows. I have stated above, in agreement with Monsieur Renan, that the sacred expression Europes, as used among the Greeks to designate mankind, could not have originally been applied to them on account of their possessing the gift of articulate speech, as is pretended in the etymology of grammarians of late date, but as having proceeded from Meru. Such an explanation, the consequence of which is to carry back this name of the sacred mountain, the abode of the gods and the birthplace of mankind, to the most ancient period of Aryan unity, is corroborated in a manner, to my mind, quite decisive, by the existence of myths which make the Meropes to be a special and autochtonic population, of a date far back in the most ancient times, who lead a life of innocence and happiness, marked by extraordinary longevity, a feature in common with the Indian legends concerning Uttara Kuru, under the government of a king, Merops, who is sometimes represented as preserving them from the deluge in the same way as the Yima of the Iranians, and assembling them around him to shelter them from the flood, from which they alone escape. This myth is usually localized in the island of Kos, which receives the name Meropes, Meropes, or Merope. But in the island of Sifnos is all reputed to have been called Meropia in virtue of a similar tradition, and Strabo speaks of a fabulous region of the name of Meropis, which was described by Theopompus, and which seems to have been placed near the country of the Hyperboreans. Merops is also given as a king of the Ethiopians, the most pious and most virtuous of men, the husband of Clymene, the mother of Phaethon, and consequently anterior to the catastrophe of the conflagration of the universe, by which the first human race, that of the Golden Age, is often said to have been destroyed. Or else the same name is given to a prophet king of Rhinadakos in Mysia, who also receives the very significant appellation of Makar, or Macarius, the Happy. All this shows that the paradisiac myth of Meropes was not peculiar to the island of Kos, but was current elsewhere in the Greek world, and had undergone more than one localization there. Plato's story of lost Atlantis, the island which the ocean god Poseidon prepared for his son Atlas to rule over, is a fascinating picture of the antediluvian world. Whether originating in Egypt, as claimed by Plato, or inherited as part of the legendary wealth of the Hellenes, it is of special interest to us in the present discussion, and this for three reasons. First, we have elsewhere shown that in oldest Greek thought, Atlas belongs at the North Pole, and it is only reasonable to locate the kingdom of Atlas in the same locality. Secondly, some authorities have unconsciously placed Atlantis in just this polar position by identifying its inhabitants with the Hyperboreans. Thirdly, Apollodorus and Theopompus expressly call the lost land Meropia, and its inhabitants Meropes, i.e., according to the above authorities, issued from Meru. The fabled country further resembles Eden in the difficulties which scholarship of every kind has found in giving it a location in harmony with all the data. These difficulties are so great that some learned writers have located it as far to the west as America, others as far to the east as the Sea of Azov, or in Persia. Even of those who have sought a place for it in the mid-Atlantic, some have pushed it up and some down, until one of the latest writers says, all hypotheses are permissible. His illustrious countryman, Monsieur J.S. Bailey, a century ago, came nearer the truth, when, in view of the perplexities attending to all other locations, he correctly placed his lost Atlantis in the Paleoarctic Ocean. Again, the antediluvian world was, of course, in the vicinity of lost Eden. But it is to be observed that in Hellenic tradition, Deucalion is not a Greek, but an inhabitant of a country in the high north, a Scythian. Moreover, the Scythians, as we know from Justin, were considered a very much more ancient people than the Greeks, indeed, as the very oldest in the world. Moreover, Scythia, like Polar Meru and Heriberiziati, was conceived of as a lofty region from which all the rivers of the earth descend, all of which obviously connects the antediluvian Deucalion with the primitive country at the Arctic summit of the globe. Finally, in Greek tradition, the first men lived under the benefit rule of Kronos, father of Zeus, enjoying the blessedness of the Golden Age. But it is clear from Strabo and others that the seat of Kronos' kingdom was the farthest north. Menzel begins his chapter on the Isles of Kronos with these words: "The oldest of the Greek gods, Kronos, we must conceive of as enthroned at the North Pole." We have now interrogated not only natural and ethnological science, but also the history, the traditions, and myths of the eldest nations of the world. Nowhere have we found our hypothesis inadmissible. Everywhere has it found remarkable confirmatory evidence. The aggregate of this evidence, coming from such unexplored, unexpected, and entirely different sources, is very great. It is so convincing that an advocate might well be content to leave the argument at this point, at least until some advocate of a different location shall have made out a better case than anyone has yet done. Before leaving the subject, however, we deem it wise to glance back to Chapter 2 of Part 2 and inquire whether the various points there hypothetically set forth as of necessity marked and memorable features of a North Polar paradise, if such as one ever existed, are capable of any yet not yet alleged confirmation from the fields of history and science. The results of this inquiry will appear in the part next following.